It was a cold and silent night in a hospital in a small town. The movement in the hallways was minimal, but something unusual was happening at the main entrance. A thin dog with a sad gaze stood motionless in front of the automatic doors. His eyes, fixed on the inside of the hospital, carried a mix of anxiety and despair that seemed louder than any words. Staff and visitors tried to shoo him away, but the dog always returned to the same spot, as if he were waiting for someone. 4 days, he stayed there, refusing to leave, even in the rain or cold. No one knew the exact reason for his persistence. But when the truth came out, there wasn't a single person who wasn't moved to tears. The mystery surrounding Toby grew as the days passed. Staff, patients, and even the security guards began to notice the determination of that dog who, unaware of human barriers, remained at the hospital's entrance. He seemed oblivious to everything around him, his eyes always fixed on the building's interior, as if waiting for a signal no one else could see. The hospital workers began to develop a routine around Toby. Some nurses brought him scraps of food or a blanket to shield him from the cold nights, while others just watched, intrigued. "He's not just any dog," said Donna Alzira, a cleaning lady who often talked to him during her work breaks. "That one's waiting for someone, I'm sure of it." Toby, however, barely interacted with anyone. He accepted the food offered to him but never showed any interest in leaving his vigil. During the nights, he remained still, even when the security guards tried to chase him away. Some people commented that, by dawn, Toby's eyes seemed even sadder, as if he were hoping the new day would bring something, or someone, that never arrived. Intrigued, a nurse named Julia decided to investigate. She thought Toby wasn't just another stray dog and began asking around about him. That's when a local shopkeeper revealed something that caught her attention. According to him, the dog had often been seen accompanying an elderly man known for feeding stray dogs. This man, the shopkeeper said, had disappeared days earlier, coinciding with the period when Toby started frequenting the hospital. With this clue, Julia decided to check the hospital's records. After hours of research, she found a name that gave her chills. Carlos Silva, a 72-year-old man who had been admitted to the hospital as an emergency just a few days before Toby appeared. Carlos had been brought in by neighbors after being found unconscious at home. Carlos was known in the neighborhood as the protector of dogs. He was a simple, solitary man who found joy in feeding and caring for stray animals. Toby was one of the dogs he regularly fed and, by all accounts, had formed a special bond with him. Now, everything made sense. Toby, likely guided by instinct or having followed the transport that took Carlos, stayed at the hospital as if he knew his friend was inside. Even without understanding what had happened, he knew his friend was there. And so, he kept waiting tirelessly, in the hope of seeing him again. This revelation deeply moved the hospital staff. Everyone who had previously observed Toby from a distance now began to mobilize to help him. It was impossible not to be touched by the unwavering loyalty of a dog who, even without any guarantee of seeing Carlos again, stood firm in his vigil. However, there was growing concern. Carlos was in critical condition, and his future was uncertain. Even so, Toby seemed indifferent to time or circumstances. For him, the only thing that mattered was being there, waiting for the man who meant everything to him. With the discovery of the bond between Toby and Carlos, the story took on even more emotional proportions. Now, everyone in the hospital knew that Toby was not just a stray dog. He was the embodiment of loyalty and unconditional love. But while Toby patiently waited, Carlos's condition remained critical, and the news from the medical team was not encouraging. Carlos was in the ICU, battling a severe infection that had spread throughout his body. His condition was so delicate that he was sedated, and up until that moment, he had no idea that his loyal friend was outside, braving the cold and rain for him. The medical team was doing everything possible to stabilize him, but the prognosis was uncertain. Each passing day seemed like an even greater challenge, both for Carlos and for Toby, who continued his silent vigil. For Toby, each day felt endless. Even without fully understanding what was happening, he knew something had changed and that his place was there, waiting for Carlos. Despite the general commotion, the hospital faced a dilemma. Dogs were not allowed inside the building, especially in areas like the ICU, where the risk of infection was high. The team, torn between strict rules and the desire to help, began looking for alternatives. Yet every attempt to find a solution seemed futile. Toby, for his part, showed no signs of giving up. He endured torrential rain and freezing nights without moving from his spot. In a moment that touched everyone's hearts, Toby was seen lying in front of the automatic doors, motionless, with his gaze fixed on the hospital's interior, as if he were waiting for a signal from his friend. That scene was enough to convince even the most skeptical staff members that something needed to be done. It was then that the team decided to try something different. They requested permission to bring Carlos to an outdoor area where Toby could see him, even from a distance. However, Carlos's condition was so critical that any movement could put his life at risk. When this attempt was ruled out, Julia, the nurse who had discovered the connection between the two, insisted on an even bolder idea: bringing Toby to Carlos's room. The idea seemed impossible, given the hospital's rules, but the team began to rally. A petition was organized among the staff, and even the strictest doctors were convinced that this reunion could have a positive impact on Carlos's recovery. Meanwhile, Toby continued to wait, unaware of the efforts being made to help him. By now, he was considered part of the hospital's routine, and many staff members took a few minutes out of their day to pet him or talk to him. Despite this, Toby remained focused, as if he knew it was not yet time to rest. Finally, after days of negotiations and adjustments, permission was granted. Toby could visit Carlos, under strict hygiene and safety conditions. What no one expected was the impact this reunion would have, not just on Carlos and Toby, but on everyone who witnessed the moment. The conflict seemed to reach a breaking point. On one side, Carlos was fighting for his life in a silent room, while Toby eagerly waited for a chance to see him. On the other, an entire team of people came together to overcome barriers, driven by the power of a connection that transcended any rule or convention. The reunion was about to happen, and everyone knew it would be an unforgettable moment. After days of waiting and negotiations, the moment finally arrived. Under the watchful eyes of the medical team and hospital staff, Toby was brought into Carlos's room. The safety measures were rigorous. Toby was carefully cleaned, and the room was sterilized to ensure no contamination could endanger Carlos's fragile health. Even so, an anxious silence filled the hallway, as if everyone was waiting for something extraordinary. When the room door opened, Toby hesitated for a moment, as if he could feel the gravity of the situation. But as soon as his eyes found Carlos lying in bed, something changed. He pulled on the leash with force and ran toward his friend, ignoring the people around him. His paws softly touched the floor, but his movements were resolute. When Toby entered the room, Carlos, still frail, seemed to react to the familiar sound of the dog. His fingers moved slightly, his eyes opened with difficulty, and a deep sigh filled the room. Toby's usually calm and serious expression transformed into pure excitement. He began wagging his tail and letting out small whimpers, as if calling Carlos back to life. The doctors and nurses were stunned as they witnessed what seemed impossible. Carlos, who until then had shown minimal signs of improvement, fully opened his eyes and looked directly at Toby. With difficulty, he lifted his hand and murmured something barely audible. "My friend, you came." In response, Toby gently rested his head on Carlos's chest, just as he used to do on the streets when they rested together. The entire room was filled with palpable emotion, and many of those present couldn't hold back their tears. In the minutes that followed, something even more surprising happened. Toby's presence seemed to bring new energy to Carlos. Despite still being weak, he began to show small signs of improvement, such as steadier breathing and greater awareness of his surroundings. For the medical team, it was a clear case of psychological improvement positively impacting the patient's physical state. For everyone else, it felt almost miraculous. Carlos, his face still pale, managed to say a few short words, expressing how much he had missed Toby. The dog, in turn, didn't leave his side for even a second, keeping his gaze fixed as if ensuring he wouldn't lose sight of him again. After this reunion, Carlos's recovery was faster than anyone could have predicted. In the following days, he was able to sit up in bed, speak more clearly, and even eat on his own. The doctors were impressed, but no one doubted that Toby's presence had been a decisive factor. The impact of that moment wasn't limited to Carlos's room. The story spread throughout the hospital, and many people began visiting Toby, moved by his loyalty. He became a symbol of hope and unconditional love, reminding everyone that even in the most difficult moments, true connections can bring strength and light. As Carlos continued to improve, Toby kept his vigil, this time inside the hospital, by his friend's side. For both of them, the reunion marked the beginning of a new chance at life, proving that the strength of a true bond can overcome any obstacle, even when all seems lost. Over the following weeks, Carlos recovered enough to be discharged. On the day he left the hospital, Toby was waiting at the entrance, exactly in the same spot where he had remained the entire time. When Carlos appeared, the dog ran to him, jumping and wagging his tail, as if to say, "I never left you." The scene moved everyone present. Many couldn't hold back their tears as they witnessed the connection between the two. After his discharge, Carlos received help from the hospital staff and the community to find a small apartment where he could start over with Toby. The neighborhood, touched by their story, came together to ensure the two had the support they needed. The story of Toby and Carlos reminds us that even in the hardest times, love and loyalty can surpass all barriers. Toby wasn't just a dog. He was living proof that the purest connections are those that don't require words. In a world often marked by indifference, Toby's dedication showed that the bonds between humans and animals transcend all barriers. What Toby did wasn't just waiting. He demonstrated that true love never abandons, even in the most challenging moments. After all, as Carlos said during his first visit to the hospital, Toby isn't just a dog. He's my family. And so, Toby and Carlos proved that sometimes, the greatest acts of love come from those we least expect. A lesson that will undoubtedly remain in the hearts of all who witnessed their story.